My name's Brian Collins. You listen to a long list of things that I do now, but actually what I'm here, I think, more usefully to do is reflect on my time as a ex-departmental chief scientific advisor. Between 2006 and 2011, I had the responsibility of being the CSA in the Transport Department, briefly on energy and business innovation and skills, which is a fairly broad set of remits. I'm trying to see if I can outdo Ian Chubb. 9 secretaries of state, 7 permanent secretaries, and 1 general election during that period. When I was interviewed for that first job by Sir David King, he asked the usual interview question of, what do you bring to the job then? And the answer I actually cheekily said was I aspired to be a polymath. Aspired is actually an important word, because you ever think you are one, you've probably lost the plot. But then I unpicked it and actually thought afterwards, and it was retrospective, I didn't actually realise it at the time, that I obviously needed a fairly broad range of knowledge about science. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to do the job. But it was more than that. It was actually knowing who knew the things I didn't know and knew them at a level of integrity that I could trust, a word that's been uttered a lot. And thirdly, I knew how to communicate ideas and concepts to people who were unfamiliar with what I was talking about. And then I reflected back on how did I aspire to know how to do that. I'd actually been trained at one point as a professional consultant, and I went through a proper professional services training program, which first line of which is understand the client's business. Understand the client in depth. Don't even have a conversation with them until you've done all the desk research to find out what it is will matter to them at the first point of conversation, because if you don't capture their attention in the first 90 seconds, you've probably lost the plot. And that actually stood me in very good stead. So I'd leave that as hanging thing to think about of training of chief scientific advisors, is there's a body of literature out there on the professional services industry on how they do it well. We've probably all bought consultancy services, so we all know what bad looks like. And you're delighted, of course, when someone walks through the door doing it well. My 3 areas of concern are firstly the one which, because I'm a professor of engineering policy at UCL, is engineering advice. We've heard a huge amount about what you need to know in terms of science, but knowing things in quite a lot of circumstances, in my experience, is not enough. Understanding what's practical and critical in a lot of circumstances is also important. And as an anecdotal story, and as the last speaker before, this person says almost nothing at the end, are you, Peter? I thought I'd just offer one anecdote of a Secretary of State who thought, because he understood what one wind farm would do if he put it out in the ocean, he could set a target which, when you multiply it by a certain number, would deliver that number of gigawatts. What he didn't think about was, could I do that by the date he set as the target? It only needed a very simple piece of arithmetic on the back of the ubiquitous cigarette packet, which is probably a metaphor we shouldn't use anymore, to show that this was totally impractical. Now, I could not get him into a conversation about the lack of practicality of his political directive. He just wouldn't entertain a conversation about it. Failure on my part, because I just couldn't find an entry point to that conversation. I know other of my colleagues tried, and we all failed. And after about a year, he discovered other people had told him what the economic impact would be of where he was going. I had a number of circumstances like that. So one of the pieces of advocacy I would put out, particularly when we're talking about science advice close to things that turn into engineering product, and I'm not just talking about wind farms, biomedical devices, transport systems, ICT, they all suffer from lack of engineering knowledge when policies are being created. Second point I want to raise is we've talked about governments. Indeed, it's in the title of the event. But governments aren't the only bodies that govern. So my question is the scale and nature of governance to which we give advice. Now, most of us, and myself included, worked predominantly talking to a national government. But actually, the national government had agencies who needed just about as much advice as the central government department. International governments needed advice as well, and I had to work quite closely at one point because Anne wasn't in post then with parts of the European Union. And the problem we were talking about then is still with Anne, so we still haven't resolved it. This is biofuels, which is going to go on for a bit, isn't it? And also, importantly, local government, because a lot of government policy that comes out of central government is actually instantiated by local government, and very importantly, and I'm quite passionate about this one, in cities. 70% of the world and 70% of the GDP of the world is going to come from about 150 cities. So city governors are very important, whether you call them mayors or elected officials or whatever. They actually are going to control how most of the human beings on the planet are going to live in 50 years' time. Where are their chief scientific advisors on a whole range of different topics? I know very few who have a chief scientific advisor. So I'll leave that one hanging as well. And the last area, which I don't think we've given anything like enough airtime to, is digital science. The digital world is transforming everything we do. It's doing it very quickly. It's doing it so fast that a lot of our organizational structures are not changing the way they think about things fast enough. One of my colleagues in the room is a proper control engineer. I only aspire to be one. It's one of those polymath things. And if you've got rapid change in fundamental time constants in part of a set of interrelated control systems, you end up with instability very quickly. It's a well-known phenomena. And so we're seeing some of that. So that's my experience of doing that. The reason I'm now a professor of engineering policy at UCL is with colleagues, we've set up a new department which is starting to teach people who are in policy frameworks, science, technology, and engineering, and vice versa. Because most of us have been whinging about the fact that policy guys don't get science, technology, and engineering, and vice versa. So we've stopped whinging about it. We're going to start educating people. Lastly, and the last person to talk before Sir Peter talks again, I'm going to say, Peter, thank you very much for organising this fantastic event. I was thinking, as I was thinking what I'd say now, that actually you've given us an enormous amount of food for thought. Then I thought, actually, we haven't been eating really. What we've been doing is smelling the cooking that's coming out of the kitchen. There is a huge amount of eating to do, and what I hope we're going to be able to do collectively with your leadership is to take forward this agenda over many years to come.